So I'm going to ask our next panel to come on up and get situated. We've got three national experts, and we looked for the best and the brightest on issues around higher ed and K12 and some early learning who can be here to speak. And after we got our speakers, we realized we invited one Natalie and three Michaels to the stage. So you're going to have to bear with us today, because we have a Michael, a Mike, and then there's Mike Griffith also. And so I'm excited to introduce Secretary Natalie Shirley from Oklahoma. She is the Secretary of Education and Workforce for Governor Mary Fallin. She also serves as the president of the Oklahoma State University in Oklahoma City. Mike Baumgartner has been a resource that many of you have utilized over the years. Mike Baumgartner is currently the executive director of the Nebraska Coordinating Commission for Post-Secondary Education, but in a former life for a while, he served as the Vice President of Finance for Complete College America, which has touched many of your states in different ways. And Michael Kirst, in a couple of former lives, actually was working at the U.S. Department of Education and was doing a lot of planning on elementary and secondary ed. But in my life, as I've worked with Michael, he's been the president of the California State Board of Education for quite some time and working very intimately with the executive branch here in California. And I always like Mike's comment because he says, we've got a lot of things to do in California, we think we're special, but if I'm correct, California educates the same number of students in K12 as 22 states combined. So just population changes as you think about that. They're educating the same number as the 22 smallest states combined as just students. So excited to have all three of them joining Michael for this panel, and please join me in welcoming them.
So we're excited to have this panel. It's intentionally a mix of groups. Instead of having all K12, all higher ed, all career and tech, we wanted to have someone provide a voice for each one of these groups. So we're going to ask each one of the presenters here, panelists, to talk for just a little bit about your area, see what you're seeing in the funding realm, and then afterwards we're going to have a nice Q&A, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So if you could start.
Certainly. Well, for those of you who've been working in higher education any length of time over the past 20 years, you know that resources have been on a decline from the states. Lots of things are going on in the states that require additional funding, K-12, Medicaid, corrections, and higher education often bears disproportionate cuts from that. And at the same time, we know over that time period that the skills, information, and knowledge we gain from a post-secondary education are increasingly and incredibly important for meeting the workforce needs that we have in our states. So as we look at this combination of things, facts about our economies, our populations, our students, it's been incumbent upon the states to look at how they can coordinate their resources better and address gaps that prevent students from completing what they're after. Now, there are three basic operating pies or pieces of pies for higher education funding. One is the state funding for operations, and if you go back, say, pick 25 years, you will see, as I mentioned, a long-term secular decline in the amount of funding that's provided per FTE on an inflation-adjusted basis to post-secondary institutions. Particularly over the last 10 years, we've not come back to where we were before the Great Recession, and that's led to a greater reliance of students from their own pockets. Tuition, and as a result of tuition increases, the borrowing increases, both in terms of the numbers of students and the amount they're borrowing, and the great concern that we see all over based on student debt and how it affects the futures of those students. And a third big trend during the past 25 years in terms of these operations has been the growth of the federal government in providing resources, both in terms of the Pell Grant, the exploding federal loan programs, but also in research, in veterans benefits. And if you haven't looked at the 2015 Pew Charitable Trust report on federal funding to see how it's crossed the line and providing more than states at this point for higher education funding, I urge you to take a look at that because that was really eye-opening. So we have these different funding sources, and some are gone up, some have gone down, and states are trying to deal with that to meet their completion goals, to meet their economic goals. I want to put in a plug, first of all, before looking at that, to say that there's no better way, I don't believe, to fund post-secondary education than to make sure that you are working toward adequate, stable, and predictable funding for your institutions and an underlying need-based financial aid program. That is tried and true, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to reflect on those gaps and coordinate better, as I've mentioned, but that foundation is so important. You can try any new sort of thing, but if you're really undercutting what your institutions are receiving, if you're not paying attention to the need-based aid for the students, you're not going to achieve your goals. So what are some other ways that states are dealing with these different streams of funding and trying to coordinate? Well, one that a lot of your states have tried is performance funding, and if you haven't tried it, I'm sure you've heard about it. Some of the major players in that are Tennessee, Ohio, Indiana, Florida, Oklahoma, Washington's community college system. And the intent is to reach state goals through reaching campus goals by coordinating the resources better at the campus level. How much can we make changes and make rewards for those changes by doing things such as adding more advisors, investing in integrated planning and advising systems, adding more faculty sections to make sure required courses are covered, and then measuring the outcomes, measuring outputs to make sure that what we're doing is having an effect. Another strategy that is being widely used and talked about here a lot is the dual credit courses. And what I want to talk in terms of finance for dual credit courses is it's all over the place. And in some of your states, you're paying for the dual credit courses completely, and in some of the states, it's falling primarily on the students. Now, those students aren't eligible for Pell Grants as they're still in high school, and so it falls on to philanthropy usually, or a state program, or rebates or discounts that the community colleges or universities are giving. We have a program in Nebraska called the Access College Early Program that is specifically for low-income students who have to pay some tuition, don't have Pell eligibility, and that's a place where we're plugging that gap, getting college credit to those students who don't have Pell eligibility yet. It's not as large as I'd like it to be. We could serve more students, but it is a starting point if your state is not ready to go all the way in funding dual credit courses. And a third trend that is in the news and that many of you are experiencing in your states, either in legislation or actually trying, is the free college movement, particularly in Tennessee, Oregon, now New York, but Minnesota, Kentucky, and Indiana also have some options. And this is another way of coordinating the resources you have, coordinating resources in order to make students know that they have something available to them that they didn't think they had, when they still have to fill out the FAFSA. They still have to think about the other funding sources that are available. They still have to do the work to get into college, but that will be free to them at that point. These are last dollar scholarships, so in terms of coordination or filling in gaps, the student has to fill in the FAFSA first, and if they have Pell funding or state funding, they use that first, and then the other state money is put on top. I like students to have some availability of their Pell funds for other purposes, so the last dollar scholarships I'm anxious to see how they're working going forward, but one of the beauties of them is that students do fill out the FAFSA, and we have so many students that don't fill out the FAFSA and initiatives to fill out the FAFSA that this is a great starting point in any event to coordinate the resources that the state has and the federal government has and the student can bring. So those are just three things, Mike, that I wanted to bring up that are going on right now.
Great, thanks. Michael, if you can kind of talk about K12?
Yes. For the first time since 1978, California overhauled its K12 school financing program from top to bottom. And I think there's two noteworthy things for the audience here. One is our focus on state to local financing in terms of concentrated poverty. And the other is the rare attempt among states to improve the local school budgeting process to pay attention more to strategic resource allocation. So our state has 6.3 million pupils, and the majority of them are Hispanic at 53%, 25% white, Asian 16%. So it's a very African American at 6%. So it's a very diverse situation. So we decided, in the major thing in financing to start with was to give the locals more flexibility. We had a lot of categorical programs, a lot of education code. So we repealed most all the categorical programs, did a search and destroy on old education code to try and give them more flexibility. Then the state to local district formula, we passed a Proposition 30 that Governor Brown led, which led to an increase in our sales and income taxes, a lot of which went to finance education. And we set up a formula which is very simple, but I think interesting. One, of course, we adjusted for the grades. But secondly, we decided to have extra money for 3 categories of children. Low-income children, English learners who are not low income, not many of those, and foster care children. So if you're a school district, you get 20% more for all of these children you have. And here's the idea of concentrated poverty. We believe this is especially important to look at in terms of these communities that are concentrated and segregated and largely language speaking of non-English. So if your district has 55% more of these pupils, you get 50% more per pupil. So it's really a very, if you will, egalitarian formula. And our low-income districts, including Los Angeles, which is 84% poverty, they're up by 50% per pupil in 4 years, 50% per pupil. So this is really quite a strong input into their systems, and we had enough money to also fund all of the districts to get them back to where they were before the recession in 2007 and 2008. So concentrated poverty idea, I think, is at the heart of our thinking. As this money, there's a lot of money went out. The legislature and the governor agreed on something, an animal I haven't quite seen before, called the Local Control Accountability Plan. So this is not telling the districts how to spend the money, but having the districts make up a plan, a 3-year plan, on how they could strategically allocate their resources to meet some state priorities and also meet the problems that are showing up on our outcome measures, which California uses an education dashboard of 5 top-line indicators that are federal and state compliant, and then 4 local indicators, including things like school climate and parent engagement, so that they could connect. And the plan leads them through thinking process to connect your income of money to your outcomes in that regard. The counties approve these plans. They don't even send them to the state government. Again, the counties are looking at the process they're doing in this. So what we've gotten out of this, though it's still a work in progress, are a couple interesting things. We required much more parent engagement at the local level. Local budget sessions are usually not heightened by a lot of parent input. In part, that's because the categories that are down at the local level, this is why we don't know special ed, are in these huge non-transparent buckets: administration, instruction, fixed costs, and so on. So we've tried to disaggregate that into more of a program approach. So we've gotten more parent engagement. We have forced the 2 sides of the local budget house to talk to each other, often for the first time: curriculum and instruction and the local budget office. You'd be amazed how little they interact. And so this plan requires them to sit down together, and we also have local people now called strategic plan budget people that add that to their jobs. We require a 3-year plan, so they have a 3-year plan. The fact that the money is going, the extra money for concentration and supplemental funding is going to those groups, puts a lot of pressure on the local districts to say, well, we can't just put all this in salaries. We have to meet some of these things that we really need, where the money is being targeted at these children. And though we don't, it's not a Title I thing where it follows down to the child at this point. So that's really, I think, our story in terms of trying to do that. We brought the charters into this funding system, so they were in a separate funding system. They're all part of it at this point. But I guess I'd close by saying I don't think states pay enough attention in this era of efficiency we're coming into now with our economies beginning to slow, to the local budget process. It's largely a process, it's formulaic, it's incremental, it's non-transparent, and a lot of worry about whether it's balances, but not a lot of strategic resource allocation. So we have programs and other assistance agencies, nonprofits, to assist on this local strategic allocation thinking. I'll stop there.
Okay, great, thanks. Natalie, could you tell us what you're seeing?
All right, I'm Natalie Shirley. My name used to be Mike, but I changed it so that I wouldn't confuse you all, because I didn't figure that you could tell us apart otherwise. I'm actually going to come at this from a slightly different vantage. The title of this panel is Uncovering New Opportunities. But I think first we have to talk about why we have this problem, and then look to see where there may be other solutions. Today, this moment, Oklahoma has 60,000 open jobs, even though Oklahoma is one of the lesser populated states in the Union. Why do we have those open jobs? They're open because we don't have citizens who are trained or educated to take those jobs. About half of the folks in the United States have some form of post-secondary training or education. And yet, by 2025, Lumina projects that we're going to need 61% to have some form of post-secondary training or education. Every person in this room knows that there is a correlation, a direct correlation, direct positive correlation between the amount of education you have and the amount of earnings that you will make. And you know further that the more earnings your citizens have, the more taxes are paid, and the healthier your system is. So, what can we learn about that? Proper funding for training and education, starting from K through 12 through post-secondary, is a must. We have to have that. However, funding for primary, K through 12, is a long-term play. Funding for post-secondary is a much shorter-term play, but we're still not going to be able to close that gap of the 16.5 million people that are needed to do the jobs that we have here in America, which will therefore provide the funding that we need unless we get them trained and educated. There's actually a source of funding that is available that should be used to help augment that, and that is from the Department of Labor through the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act, or as I lovingly call it, WIOA. WIOA provides about $2 billion to help folks get training and education necessary to help them get a job or to get a better job. And yet, the overwhelming majority of those dollars are spent in administrative costs and supportive services. So when Oklahoma and 3 other states took a look at this, we decided that shouldn't be the way this happens. Because if we can train someone to get a job and to have a higher level of education or training, again, they're going to earn more and they're going to help us solve this problem. So for the first time, Oklahoma is requiring that, wait for it, 40% of those dollars will be spent on direct education and training. You wouldn't believe the pushback that I'm getting from the local workforce investment boards over this. And next year, it's going to go to 50%. 50% will be the highest highest amount of dollars that is dedicated to direct training and education. And yet there's pushback. But every state should be looking at that as an opportunity to help them fund post-secondary education and training. Now, there is also about 60 60-odd $million that comes from DOL that is dedicated to youth. Now, I will tell you that there are prescriptive rules around this, and you have to really work with them. You can't use that money, for example, a kindergarten program or even possibly an 8th grade program, but you can use it to help with other fundings, particularly for those disadvantaged youths that every state is pouring more money into. Tap into that resource. Partner with your local workforce investment boards and see if you can't bring additional dollars into your education system. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. So the question I hear all the time when we talk about state budgets is it ends up being a battle between K12 and higher ed, and groups like Career and Tech and Early Learning are trying to get into the battle, and it becomes a thing where each one of the groups within education is essentially undercutting each other in some ways to get more of that money. How do you see that these groups can deal with that and kind of, instead of working against each other, work together? So we can start here, Mike, and
Sure.
you'll solve this problem, right? And then we'll be
Well, when my previous comments, I talked about coordination and closing gaps. So there is a finite amount of money, but I think that looking at the intersection of where students are moving between high school and college is a place where we can certainly see shared interests and a way to save money and move students along more quickly. So if we're looking in terms of early remediation, identifying, as Tennessee does with its Tennessee Sales Program, where students are and whether or not they need remedial needs, and can that be taken care of before they go to college, taken care of in high school. We have a place where we'll save some money for both sides. Same thing with dual credit. We save students money, but we save institutions money as well because we're sharing the resources. Good transfer programs, focusing some money on building a transfer system or articulation agreements, things that smooth it out. Now these save students money. Everything that I'm saying saves students money, and we're talking about
That's the goal, right?
dividing up and well, partnering at the same time. But I think looking for those places where we can coordinate our operations better and accomplish both of our goals, getting students out of high school, getting students into the workplace, getting students certificated, getting students into post-secondary education. There are just 4 or 5 clear areas where a lot of states are working where you can do that and share resources. And I would like to see more resource sharing like that in my own state, but I think that is a clear place given what we know we need for students in the pipeline to make that connection and move those forward.
Okay, thanks. Michael, would you?
Yeah, California's really woken up to the problem because of partly our success. Everybody here is working on college and career ready. So we have a curve for the students that are eligible for 4-year universities, 4 years of English, 4 years of math. That's going up like that. And our higher ed capacity is going up like that. So all of a sudden, K12 is successful, and there's nowhere to put them. San Jose State got 50,000 applications, took 20,000. Long Beach State got 60,000 applications, took about 20,000. So I remember talking to Texas about this years ago. What if we really succeeded in college ready? Where are we going to put them in Texas? So I think that's an issue that's coming to the fore. On Career Tech, we created a joint committee between the community colleges and the State Board of Education. The community colleges have 3 members. I appoint 3 of my members to this joint board. And we're looking particularly at our linkages on career pathways from high school to college, particularly community college, so that's an angle. Preschool is in California really a mess, and I think Oklahoma is in a lot better shape from what I read. It's a set of historical accretion of categorical programs, some run by the state, some by the counties, some by local school districts, some by nonprofits. And the general view of the Department of Finance is the system needs more money, but not this system. It's just scattered. It's a non-system. And I think too many of the early childhood advocates just go for more slots and not enough on how do you rationalize this system.
Natalie?
In the graduate, the word was The answer was plastics. That's where you wanted to be. Well, in education, I think the word is partnership. Partnerships is not only where we want to be, partnerships is where we have to be. We partner in Oklahoma as much as humanly possible, and then I push them to partner even more. On a monthly basis, I have lunch with the Chancellor of Higher Education, the head of our career tech system, and our superintendent for public schools. And every month the question is, what are we doing together, and what else can we do together? And we can do that at the highest levels, but we've also got to make sure that we're empowering people at the local level to partner. I personally, on my own college campus, have partnerships with half a dozen schools. One of them I invited to come to use a building that I had just recently shuttered because they didn't have space. In another instance, I'm partnering with a charter school, and their students will start college between their sophomore and junior year, and by the time they finish high school, they'll have an associate's degree. And again, we're sharing resources, we're sharing faculty, we're sharing teachers, we're sharing an institution. In yet another partnership that I have with yet another school, we're developing a program for apprenticeships. We're working with a local business, and they're taking a number of their juniors and seniors. We're providing concurrent education for them and a pathway so that as they continue through high school, they'll work with this business, they'll go to high school, they'll come to college, and they'll just keep right on from high school to college to work. So I think that each one of those is a different type of partnership. Each one of them serve a different need, and that's where you've got to go. You've got to talk at the local level about what do you need, what do you have, what do you need, what do you have, and see if we can figure this out. But partnering is the answer to this problem.
Great. So kind of on that, right now there's some budget issues in your state, like there are in a lot of other states. Is it easier or harder to get these partnerships going during tougher times? Do people see if we band together, we can kind of work through and find a solution with the budget? Or do you feel there's kind of more of a break part where people get tribal in a way?
Well, I think that there will always be that group of people that want to complain about the fact that there's not enough to go around. That's just going to happen. And for those people, you try to put them all together in a room so that they can do whatever they do. But for the rest of us who are willing to keep moving and try and find a solution, I find that partnering is really easier. I think the worst place you could be, I've been in Oklahoma now for 10 years, and I've been through flush times, and I've been through terrible times. The worst time of all is when there's a tiny little bit of money and people fight about it. It's actually easier when there's no money, because then you do have to come together to find a way to make things work. It's sort of like the guy who's got a fish and the guy who's got some bread. Come together and you've got a meal.
Great. Michael, could you talk a little bit, talking about change in budget situations, how you were able to make the big change in California to adopt an entirely new school funding system that really changed the way you guys kind of do business there in K12? What were some of the lessons learned on all that?
Yeah, well, we were lucky about the fact that the policy window, there's a theory of when the policy window opens and you can make big change. And there's three vector forces that come together. We had all three. We had a rapidly rising tide of revenue because we came roaring out of the recession. We're primarily financed off of progressive income taxes, and they yield a lot of money when the economy is going up. Then we passed a tax increase that the governor fought for. The governor also said that if the legislature didn't pass this school finance program, they were in, quote, the fight of their lives. So you had this a positive revenue stream. Then you had a united political coalition. We had all factors of the education community behind us. The teachers union had, is always nervous about change, but they saw, well, all this local flexibility means more money at the table, at the local table. So they were interested in that. And so we had that aspect of it. It doesn't hurt that we're 2/3 of both houses are Democrats, I should say, and they are, that we have a governor who's also a Democrat. So we had a united coalition, which is really held together, and coalition building is very, very important. And lastly, we had some big ideas, and the finance ideas really caught on. I think part of it is that nobody could defend the old system. When they talk of change, make them defend your old system. I mean, it was an irrational historical accretion of nonsense, and there were only about 15 people in the state who understood it, and they made a lot of money. But that was we really pounded away on how terrible the current system was, and there was no pushback. And then, the budget was so good that we could actually help the wealthier suburbs by bringing them back. In the end, they kept pleading for money, and we had enough. So I think it was, a really interesting confluence, and you need to look for those openings of time.
So I will say, I get this question all the time. Who has the most complicated formula? Every state believes they have the most complicated one out there, the hardest to understand. You guys used to be tied for first, and the most confusing with Delaware. Delaware is now in the lead for the most confusing formula in the country. So congratulations. But yours was confusing in a different way because of all these separate pockets of money. Mm-hmm. And I remember having a conversation with your Department of Education. I talked to 3 different people, and they told me 3 different numbers for the different pockets of money. Somebody said there were 70, somebody said 95, and somebody said 120. It gets to that point where clarity is part of it. Talking about that, Mike, could you talk about how often do you kind of go out to the public and talk to them and talk about these funding issues? I think a lot of them, especially for parents when we're talking higher ed, it can get confusing. They can not quite understand when they can and can't use Pell Grants, how some of these programs work for them or don't. How are you able to kind of take finance and go out to the public and do it?
Well, it would be mostly around financial aid. There aren't that many people who want to talk about Base Plus or community college funding formulas, and in Nebraska, they're frankly pretty simple compared to other things. But for the financial aid program, that's very important. We have an outstanding financial aid program officer who meets with counselors and financial aid officers from across the state, participates in national organizations to work with them to understand the programs that we have. Our major program, the Nebraska Opportunity Program, is a grant that is made to the schools and then distributed to the students. So it's called a decentralized system. So in that respect, we don't contact those students so much, but we do work with counselors and with financial aid officers. We bring in teachers to talk with them at certain points of the year. And we've been a part of the name escapes me, but we're getting students to understand better whether or not their Pell is completed. Pell Completion Initiative, using Colorado software. And a number of states partnered with that, where the school counselors are able to look on a website that we've set up securely with the Department of Ed, blessing, that allows them to see if their students have completed the FAFSA, if they've completed it and it's been selected for further review, or if everything's done. And we have workshops for the counselors on that, and that's been very effective. We're also very lucky in our state to have an organization called Education Quest, which is a foundation, and it has offices across the state where it will walk through the FAFSA with students and their parents in different parts. You can make an appointment, you can do it in Omaha, you can do it in Lincoln, you can do it farther out west. They will go to your high school. And so that's something that we partner with, but the state's not on the hook for that, so that's a great benefit as well. So.
Great. Well, we're getting towards the end. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions and answers, but I would like our panelists to kind of have one last say before we move into that, and what that is so I get pulled into conversations in the hallways at meetings like this, and I'm sure you all do too. What is the one piece of advice, if you just had a couple of minutes to say to somebody, you're dealing with this funding issue in your state, what's the one thing you'd give them as a takeaway? And we'll start with you.
I think in my particular state, I'd say, look, Nebraska has historically funded its public institutions well, and as a result, we have low tuition. We have low tuition, and so we have high enrollment, and we have pretty good completion figures. We have a good system, and there are ways that we can tinker with it, but think about what we have now before you start thinking about new things that we need that might work, might not, and think about the financial aid program. So if I were in a different circumstance, if I were in Illinois, I would think I would tell a different story.
Okay, fair enough, yeah.
That's what I would say in my
Great,
state.
thanks.
Yeah.
Michael,
Yeah, in reflecting on this, I would go to with your first question. You know, what California should be doing is thinking about it's all one system, pre-K through post-secondary. And we're simply not configured to think about that very carefully. And we need some mechanism, and some gigantic committee doesn't make any sense, and I don't know what that mechanism is, but really think hard on how to do that. I wish I had some answers.
One of the things that Oklahoma has done in the last couple of years is work on a specific grant that required the participation of all of the education systems in Oklahoma. And it was a large enough grant and an important enough grant that it really forced everyone to the table to clarify what the end goal was and where we want to end up. Now that doesn't mean that sometimes folks don't spin off into space and we have to bring them back. But focusing on a single goal has really crystallized what we're trying to do in Oklahoma and help us chart a path forward.
great, thanks a lot. So first off, I want to thank our panelists for presenting. Now I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions and answers, and I hope there are plenty out there. We have some in the...
One back here to start.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Don Means with the Shelby Coalition from DC, the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition. A question, Dr. Kirst. About 15 years ago, there was a 2/3 requirement to pass local school bonds, and we passed Prop 39 that lowered that to 55% margin. Can you tell us what the result of that was?
We were able, all across the state, to get 55% to vote locally for more school construction. It was an enormous difference between requiring 2/3 and requiring 55%. And so it was a roaring success. It was also a coalition with the charter school advocates. We were very strong in our state because they got a cut of the facilities money. So all of the big money behind the charters in California came in with the public schools that are traditional schools behind it. So what we need to do now is lower the ability to levy some property taxes from 2/3 down to 55%, and that would make a big difference too.
Right.
Hi, Tony Smith, State Superintendent, Illinois, and Chair of the Teacher Retirement System in Illinois. Currently about 40% funded. So I'm just curious about the analysis across the board on the pension cost shift and the impact specifically in California, but just thoughts about shifting that cost to local districts and what you're thinking about that is.
Well, I think we have shifted the costs, as you know, to local districts. We raised the requirement for the pensions from about 10% of their payrolls up to 19% over a period of 10 years. So the state has put in more money as well. We've sort of stabilized it. I don't think it's fully solved the problem. But that goes back to my view on local budgeting and efficiency. This, I think, will be an age of efficiency. Because if you look at these districts, they have the built-in pension costs, that's going up. They pay for step and column increases on teacher salaries. That's supposedly uncontrolled. They're going to pay more for gas because we raised our gas tax to repair our roads. And they have other costs that go up that are more or less uncontrollable. So you can increase schools by 3-4%, and that's all eaten up in these fixed costs. So that's what's leading us to much more focus on how do we get more strategic resource allocation and thinking about the priorities.
And just to kind of add that this is a national trend right now that we're seeing more and more states. Your state is actually probably in the worst condition right now with pensions, but there's a lot of other states that are having this issue, and they're trying to find some way or another to close that gap, that funding gap. Sometimes that means moving the cost down to the districts. Sometimes that means moving it over to the teachers. So teachers have to pay a higher percentage to kind of cover these costs. But states are really struggling with this. This isn't a problem that's in most states going to create issues tomorrow, but it's definitely going to create issues down the road if you don't start fully funding your pension programs. That's why we're also seeing more and more states look at different ways of retirement. So moving some teachers over to a 401k type of system, or maybe a hybrid of the two. But a lot of that is so tricky because if you move your teachers over to a 401k, it can actually increase your liability for your pension. So this is something, no one's found a silver bullet, but it's definitely something people realize is an issue out there and they're trying to work towards a solution. Oh my gosh, there are only 2 questions. Don't make me start talking about the Detroit Tiger baseball team and why we need to start trading some of our players, because we will fill the time with that. But Michael, talking about some of that stuff with the California budget, and that there are these sort of ongoing fixed costs. We have that in higher ed too. We have that in career and tech. How did you address that when you did the formula, or did you address it, saying we know there's always going to be an increase of 4% that we're going to have to cover every year? How did you sort of take that into account when you made your changes in the formula?
Well, that was, as I've indicated, part of our local control accountability plan. We don't tell them how to spend the money. The last time we changed teacher salary structures in the United States was 1924, when we equalized the women with the men. And ever since then, it's been step and column areas. So I think we need to start looking at some of the issues around the automatic costs there. But we have tried to lead the locals through a thinking process of how to allocate resources, how to look at costs that they, just regard as sunk costs that they can't really do anything about in the existing budget. I think that's important. We've tried to work on some special education areas of cost control there, as well as effectiveness. But I think this really has to take, you can't pull wires at the state level and get local budgets to be more efficient. You can set up processes, you can set up some kinds of formats, which we've done. But at the bottom, I think, this has to be a really better interplay at the local level.
And that kind of issue of increasing cost every year just to provide the same kind of services is going to hit both higher ed and CTE. Mike, can you talk about it from your end, and then I'd like to hear Natalie.
Well, it's hitting us this year because we didn't know the fixed costs that the colleges and universities are going to face, and our budget wasn't in such a situation this year that we could address all those. And part of that is going to fall on tuition increases, which were a little bit higher than what we'd like, but the institutions are definitely at the same time looking at efficiencies, looking at the number of courses and programs that they're offering, looking at their construction projects. We haven't talked about capital, but capital is important, not just in terms of building the building, but in operating the building. And how long can we put off opening a building fully? Does that make any sense? Or where can we find other sources of funding to try to address that? But we've also had a couple legislative resolutions to look at efficiencies within one of our systems to see if some campuses should be consolidated, or at least some of their functions consolidated. Again, they've got to come up with ways to meet those fixed costs that they have. And looking at ways to offer more courses online, which gets back to that capital piece. We're a big state, sparsely populated in a lot of the state, and my office reviews academic program requests. That's part of our job, to try to make sure that we don't duplicate things unnecessarily in the state. But at least half of those that are coming to us now are completely online, which doesn't mean that they're free. It doesn't mean that there aren't costs associated with the learning management systems and the cloud computing and the resources for the faculty members to put the courses online and teach them effectively. But we are able to reach more students that way, and I think over time we will be able to, we really haven't slowed down the number of facilities we're building anyway, and that's one way to deal with those costs.
Okay, great.
Yeah, let me just quickly add, I think that we need to think more about technology, not substituting robots for teachers or driverless cars, but we've really crossed in California, and I think a lot of other states as well. When we went to our statewide test, Smarter Balanced, we had to get a tremendous more broadband into the schools. And we did that, we financed that, we now have extensive broadband at every school site. And most of you are seeing, as we are, many more computers are in schools and in classrooms. And it's basically used more for platforms, for sometimes routine tasks and things of that sort. But can we get more efficiency from the technology? We finally got, we have a lot of Chromebooks, a lot of good bandwidth. What are we going to do with this? And that's of course, can we get more efficiency, and how do we utilize this? I think that's a coming issue that I don't see much about, but for the first time in my long 53-year career in this business, we're finally at the threshold where technology now is getting omnipresent, and there's, I think, not enough, beyond just putting it on platforms and so on, not enough use of thinking it through.
I think that technology is part of the solution to the way we address this. However, we're going to have to be willing to touch that third rail of, do we need, for example, all the gen ed teachers that we have across my state? I think that we're going to have to examine whether or not college algebra is something that needs to be taught by 500 people. Why don't, it's a commodity, it's not unique. It seems to me that we need to find the very best 2 or 3 college algebra professors and use them and have them, pay them a living wage, a good wage, and then allow technology to provide that education across the state. I realize that that's almost heretical, but if we're going to have technology, let's use it to disrupt the way that we've been thinking all along. Find the efficiencies, and then plow that money into things where technology may not quite have the solution, and where we actually have to have that one-on-one touch.
Question?
Oh.
Thank you. Chris Nordstrom from the North Carolina Justice Center. North Carolina is about to convene a task force to revamp our school funding formula. And this is not the first effort we've made to revamp the school funding formula. But one of the biggest barriers has been to get the policymakers to have a sort of common set of criteria and understanding of how they're going to measure different reforms to our school finance formula. Can you talk about, in California, how, if you had any process for specifically defining the criteria you're going to use to assess different finance proposals, and the successes or barriers you had to getting policymakers to understand those criteria and agree to those criteria?
Well, I think as we've talked, keep it simple. Legislators love that they can explain to their constituents how the school finance formula works. folks. Ours is so clear and direct that you can use 3 concepts and you're done. And so I think that simplification is very useful. And then, of course, thinking about the pupil needs. And then I don't think that the state should try and control local spending in terms of, we can have them consider priorities, but actually saying these are your 3 top priorities. That I think we really step back from in terms of saying you have to think about this, but you don't have to spend money on it. But I think that California is increasingly a barbell economy, pretty rich people and a lot of poor people. And I think that is really crucial in helping the legislature think this through in terms of how we're going to deal with this and how finance ties into it. So but we did rely very strongly on gubernatorial leadership. I just think in our system that's just crucial that you get that view there. The business community also liked what we were doing, and we were able to rally them to it as well. So it was I think you get to a point where things are just collapsing of their own weight, and I think that's what we ran into in California finance.
Great, thank you very much. I want to thank again our panelists for today, and I think Jeremy has some final statements.